My son's ex forced him to do 1,000 push-ups for eating cake, then called CPS claiming he was abusive. Now he's too scared to date again. The first time I noticed something was wrong with my son David was when he came to our family barbecue in July looking like he'd lost 20 pounds. At 28, David had always been lean, but now his clothes hung loose on his frame, and there was something hollow about his eyes that reminded me of the photographs I'd seen of prisoners of war. "You feeling okay, honey?" I asked, pulling him aside while his girlfriend Riley was distracted by his sister's kids playing in the pool at our house in suburban Atlanta. "I'm fine, Mom," he said, but his voice lacked the confidence I was used to hearing from my oldest child. David was a software engineer, successful and independent, the kind of young man who'd always carried himself with quiet assurance. But lately, something fundamental had changed. I watched him throughout the afternoon, noting how he barely touched the food at the barbecue, how he kept glancing nervously at Riley, how he seemed to shrink into himself whenever she spoke. Riley, on the other hand, appeared to be the perfect girlfriend, beautiful, articulate, charming with the family. She helped with the dishes, complimented my potato salad, and talked enthusiastically about her work as a personal trainer and nutritionist. "David's been so dedicated to his health journey," she told me while we cleaned up in the kitchen. "I've been helping him optimize his nutrition and fitness routine. He's made such amazing progress." Something in the way she said, "helping him," made my maternal instincts prickle, but I couldn't put my finger on what bothered me about it. David was an adult, after all, and if he wanted to get in better shape, that was his choice. But over the next few months, the changes in my son became more pronounced. He stopped joining us for our monthly family dinners, claiming he was too busy with his new routine. When he did visit, he seemed anxious and distracted, constantly checking his phone and leaving early. The easy laughter that had always been his trademark disappeared entirely. "I'm worried about David," I told my husband Robert one evening in October. "Something's not right with him. He's just focused on his relationship," Robert replied, though I could hear the concern in his voice too. "Remember how we were when we first got serious? Everything else takes a backseat. But this felt different. This felt wrong." The breaking point came on a cold November evening when David showed up at our door at nearly midnight, shaking and clearly in distress. He was wearing gym clothes despite the freezing temperature, and I could see red marks on his arms that looked like they came from some kind of workout equipment. "David, what's wrong?" I asked, pulling him inside and wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. "I need to stay here tonight," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't go back there right now." Robert came downstairs in his robe, took one look at our son, and immediately went to make coffee. We sat at our kitchen table, the same one where David had done homework as a kid, where we'd celebrated his college graduation, where we'd shared countless family meals, and waited for him to find the words. "She made me do 1,000 push-ups," he finally said, staring at his hands. "Because I ate a piece of cake at lunch. A coworker brought it for someone's birthday, and I ate a piece without asking her first." Robert and I exchanged glances. "What do you mean she made you do push-ups?" I asked carefully. "She said I'd violated our nutrition agreement. That I'd disrespected her expertise in our relationship by eating something that wasn't on my meal plan. She said I needed to earn forgiveness through physical discipline." The word, discipline, coming from my 28-year-old son's mouth in that context made my blood run cold. "David," Robert said gently, "you're an adult. No one can make you do anything you don't want to do." "You don't understand," David said, his voice breaking. "She's right about everything. I was overweight and unhealthy when we met. She's helped me become a better person. If I don't follow the program, I'll just go back to being the mess I was before." I looked at my son, this brilliant, kind, successful man who had somehow been convinced that eating a piece of cake warranted hours of physical punishment, and felt my heart break. "Honey, you were never a mess," I said. "You were perfect exactly as you were." "No, I wasn't," he insisted. "Riley showed me how much I needed to change. She tracks everything I eat, designs my workout schedules, helps me be disciplined about my goals. Without her structure, I'd just fall apart." Over the next hour, the full picture began to emerge. Riley had gradually taken control of every aspect of David's life under the guise of helping him become healthier and more successful. She monitored his food intake, designed punishing workout routines for any perceived infractions, isolated him from friends and family who might sabotage his progress, and had convinced him that he was fundamentally flawed and needed her guidance to function. "She says I have an addictive personality," David explained. "That I can't trust my own judgment about food or exercise or social situations." She's studying to become a certified life coach, so she knows about these things. The manipulation was so thorough, so expertly crafted, that David genuinely believed he was lucky to have someone who cared enough to control every detail of his existence. David, I said, choosing my words carefully, what happens if you don't follow her rules? His face went pale. She gets disappointed, and when Riley's disappointed, everything falls apart. She won't talk to me, won't let me explain, won't accept my apologies until I've proven I'm serious about changing. How do you prove you're serious? Physical consequences, he said quietly. Push-ups, extra gym time, sometimes holding planks until I collapse. She says it helps me associate poor choices with discomfort so I'll make better decisions in the future. Robert's coffee mug hit the table harder than necessary. Son, that's not a relationship. That's abuse. It's not abuse, David said quickly. She's never hit me. She's helping me be better. You don't understand how patient she is, how much time she invests in my improvement. I'm lucky she puts up with someone as undisciplined as me. The depth of the psychological conditioning was staggering. Riley had convinced David that her abuse was actually devotion, that her control was actually care, that his suffering was actually self-improvement. That night, David slept in his old room, and Robert and I lay awake until dawn talking about what we'd learned. We realized that all the warning signs had been there, the weight loss, the anxiety, the isolation from family and friends, but we'd been blind to them because Riley presented such a compelling facade of being the perfect, caring girlfriend. The next morning, David was gone before we woke up, leaving only a note apologizing for overreacting and promising to do better in his relationship. When I called him later, he didn't answer. When I texted, his responses were brief and defensive. For 3 weeks, we barely heard from him. Then, in early December, everything exploded. I was at work when my phone rang with a call from Fulton County Child Protective Services. Mrs. Martinez, this is investigator Linda Johnson with CPS. We've received a report alleging that your son David Martinez is physically abusing his girlfriend's child. We need to schedule an interview with you and your husband as soon as possible. The world seemed to tilt sideways. I'm sorry, what? David doesn't have children, and his girlfriend doesn't have children. According to our report, your son has been physically abusing a minor child in his household. The reporting party provided detailed allegations of violence and neglect. I sat down heavily in my office chair, trying to process what I was hearing. There's been a mistake. David doesn't live with any children. Ma'am, we take all reports seriously, and we're required to investigate. Can you come in tomorrow morning at 10? The CPS investigation was a nightmare that consumed our entire family for the next 2 months. Despite the fact that David lived alone and had no children in his care, the allegations were detailed and specific enough that they couldn't be dismissed without a thorough investigation. Riley had told CPS that David was abusing her 6-year-old nephew, who she claimed lived with them part-time. She provided dates, times, and descriptions of alleged abuse that were vivid enough to trigger a full criminal investigation. She even submitted photos of bruises on a child, claiming they were evidence of David's violence. The investigation revealed that Riley didn't have a nephew. The child in the photos was identified as the son of one of her clients at the gym where she worked. The bruises were from a playground accident that had been documented by the child's pediatrician weeks before Riley claimed the abuse occurred. She had somehow obtained the photos and fabricated an entire story around them. But by the time the truth came out, the damage was done. David's employer was notified of the investigation, and although he wasn't fired, he was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. His neighbors were interviewed by investigators, creating whispers and suspicions in his apartment complex. His name appeared in police reports that would follow him for years. Most devastating of all was what the false accusations did to David's psyche. He was already broken down by months of psychological abuse, and now he was facing the possibility of criminal charges for crimes he hadn't committed against a child who didn't exist. She said she was protecting other women from me, David told us during one of our conversations with investigators. She said I had violent tendencies that I didn't even recognize, and that it was her responsibility to make sure I didn't hurt anyone else. The investigator, Linda Johnson, was a veteran social worker who'd seen her share of false accusations, but even she seemed shaken by the elaborate nature of Riley's deception. In 30 years of doing this job, I've never seen someone fabricate such detailed allegations involving a child who doesn't exist, she told us. The level of manipulation and planning this took is extraordinary. The criminal investigation revealed that Riley had a history of making false accusations against ex-boyfriends. 3 previous relationships had ended with her filing police reports alleging various forms of abuse, all of which had been dropped when evidence contradicted her claims. She'd also been fired from 2 previous jobs for creating conflict and making accusations against coworkers. But perhaps most chilling was what investigators found when they searched her apartment. She had detailed journals documenting her training of David, with charts tracking his weight, workout performance, and infractions. She'd recorded some of their conversations, including audio of David doing push-ups while crying and begging her to forgive him for eating unauthorized food. "She was treating your son like a lab rat," Detective Morrison told us during one of our meetings. This wasn't just abuse, it was a systematic psychological experiment. When the false accusations were officially dismissed and Riley was charged with filing false police reports and harassment, David should have felt vindicated. Instead, he was devastated. "What if she was right about me?" he asked during one of our family therapy sessions. "What if I really do have violent tendencies that I can't see? What if the next person I date thinks the same thing?" The therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, specialized in helping victims of psychological abuse rebuild their sense of reality and self-worth. She explained that David's response was typical of abuse survivors. "Abusers are very skilled at making their victims question their own perceptions and judgment," she told us. Riley spent months convincing David that he was fundamentally flawed and needed her control to function. Even after her deception is exposed, those beliefs don't just disappear. David moved back home with us while he worked through his recovery. At 28, he was sleeping in his childhood bedroom, afraid to live alone, afraid to trust his own judgment about food or exercise or relationships. The confident, independent man we'd raised was gone, replaced by someone who jumped at loud noises and asked permission before eating meals. The physical recovery was the easy part. Within a few months, David had gained back the weight he'd lost and looked healthy again. The psychological recovery was much more complex. "I keep thinking about all the red flags I ignored," he told me one evening while we were cooking dinner together. "The way she isolated me from friends, the way she made me feel grateful for her abuse, the way she convinced me I couldn't function without her. How did I become that person?" "You became someone who trusted the wrong person," I said. "That doesn't make you weak or stupid. It makes you human." But David struggled with self-blame and shame that went beyond what even therapy could easily address. He'd been so thoroughly convinced of his own inadequacy that he couldn't imagine anyone wanting to be with him unless they were trying to fix or control him. "What if the next woman I date thinks I'm boring?" he asked during another family dinner. "Riley always said I was too passive, too boring, that I needed her to make me interesting." What if she was right? David, his sister Jessica said, "You were never boring. You were kind and funny and smart. Riley didn't make you interesting, she made you miserable." The criminal case against Riley dragged on for months. She pled guilty to filing false police reports and was sentenced to community service and probation, but the charges seemed inadequate given the devastation she'd caused. The legal system, we learned, wasn't well equipped to address the type of psychological abuse David had endured. "The problem is that what she did to you wasn't technically illegal in most cases," the prosecutor explained to us. "Emotional abuse isn't a crime in Georgia unless it involves threats of violence. Making someone do push-ups as punishment is horrible, but it's not assault if the victim consents to it." The fact that David's abuse didn't fit neatly into legal categories made his recovery even more difficult. Society understood physical violence and sexual assault, but the systematic psychological conditioning he'd endured was harder to explain and validate. "People keep asking why I didn't just leave," he told Dr. Chen during one of our sessions. "They can't understand how someone could convince me that doing 1,000 push-ups was reasonable punishment for eating cake. That's because they've never experienced systematic psychological manipulation," Dr. Chen replied. "What Riley did to you was as calculated and destructive as any physical abuse, even if it doesn't leave visible scars." A year after the CPS investigation was closed, David was still living at home and hadn't gone on a single date. He'd returned to work and seemed to be functioning normally on the surface, but anyone who knew him well could see that he was still deeply affected by his experience with Riley. "I don't think I'm ready to trust someone else with that kind of power over me," he told me when I gently asked about his social life. "What if I can't tell the difference between someone who cares about me and someone who wants to control me?" It was a legitimate fear. Riley had been so skilled at presenting her abuse as care that even our family had been fooled for months. If David couldn't trust his own judgment about something as basic as eating a piece of cake, how could he trust himself to choose a healthy partner? "Maybe I'm better off alone," he said. At least I can't hurt anyone else, and no one can hurt me. The isolation that Riley had forced on David during their relationship had become self-imposed, a protective barrier that kept him safe but also kept him from experiencing the healthy relationships that might help him heal. Dr. Chen worked with him on rebuilding his confidence and judgment gradually. They started with small decisions: what to eat for lunch, what movie to watch, what shirt to wear, and slowly worked up to bigger choices about work, friendships, and eventually, maybe, romance. Healing from psychological abuse is like learning to walk again after a traumatic injury, she explained to our family. David has to rebuild his trust in his own perceptions and judgment one small decision at a time. The process was slow and often frustrating. There were setbacks when David would second-guess decisions he'd made independently, wondering if Riley would have approved or if he was falling back into old patterns. There were days when he seemed to make progress, and others when he retreated back into the safety of letting others make choices for him. But gradually, over many months, we began to see glimpses of the confident, independent man David had been before Riley. He started cooking meals without asking if his choices were healthy enough. He bought clothes he liked without worrying about whether they met someone else's standards. He began making plans with old friends who had been cut out of his life during the relationship. "I'm starting to remember what it felt like to trust myself," he told me one evening while we were walking our dogs around the neighborhood. "It's scary, but it's also kind of exciting." The journey wasn't linear. David still had moments of doubt and anxiety, still sometimes asked for reassurance about decisions that should have been entirely his own. But each small step toward independence was a victory. Each choice made without fear was a reclamation of the autonomy Riley had stolen from him. 2 years after the CPS investigation ended, David finally felt ready to move back into his own apartment. It was a modest place, smaller than where he'd lived before, but it was entirely his choice. He decorated it according to his own taste, stocked the kitchen with foods he enjoyed, and created a space that reflected who he was rather than who someone else thought he should be. "I'm not ready to date yet," he told us during his housewarming party, "but I think I'm finally ready to be alone without being lonely." It was progress. Slow, difficult progress, but progress nonetheless. Today, 3 years after Riley was sentenced, David is slowly rebuilding his life. He's been promoted at work, has rekindled friendships that were damaged during his abusive relationship, and has started seeing a new therapist who specializes in helping abuse survivors navigate romantic relationships when they're ready. He hasn't dated anyone yet, and we don't push him about it. The trauma of having someone use false accusations to try to destroy his life left scars that go beyond what Riley did to him during their relationship. The knowledge that someone could fabricate detailed allegations of child abuse, complete with photographic evidence, has made him wary of any situation where he might be vulnerable to similar accusations. "What if the next person I date decides to make up stories about me too?" he asked during a recent family dinner. "What if someone else decides that destroying my life is easier than having an honest conversation about relationship problems?" It's a legitimate fear in an age where false accusations can spread faster than truth, where social media trials can destroy reputations before facts emerge, where the mere suggestion of wrongdoing can have lasting consequences for employment and relationships. But Dr. Chen remains optimistic about David's eventual recovery. Survivors of psychological abuse often develop better judgment about people and relationships than they had before, she told us. David's experience, as traumatic as it was, has taught him to recognize red flags and trust his instincts in ways he never did before. She's probably right. David has become incredibly perceptive about manipulation and control tactics, able to spot unhealthy relationship dynamics in other people's lives with clarity that comes from hard-won experience. "I see it everywhere now," he told me recently. Friends whose partners control their social media, coworkers whose boyfriends criticize their appearance, people who ask permission to eat or spend money or see their families. Once you've experienced it, you can't unsee it. Maybe that awareness will serve him well when he's ready to try dating again. Maybe the painful education Riley provided will help him choose healthier partners and build stronger boundaries in future relationships. Or maybe he'll decide that the risk isn't worth it, that the peace and autonomy he's rebuilt are too precious to potentially lose again. Either choice would be valid. Either choice would be his own. And after everything he's been through, the freedom to choose, whether to date or not, what to eat for lunch, how to spend his weekends, who to trust with his heart, might be the most important victory of all.